When I was growing up, there were two consoles that were really considered exotic amongst my friend group. And no, I'm not referring to a Neo Geo here. That was a whole different level of unobtainium for us. No, the consoles I'm talking about are the Master System and the TurboGrafx-16, both of which I only know two people that had them in their possession. Now, anytime you played a game on one of those consoles, like say when you went over to their house or whatever, it was almost an alien experience just because of how unique the libraries on those two consoles are. Specifically on the TurboGrafx-16, the uniqueness went to another level with a game that my friend had that to this day is one of the most bizarre experiences that I've ever had when playing a video game. That game was named JJ and Jeff, but you might also be familiar with it via its original PC Engine name, Kato and Ken. The game was originally named for the host of a Japanese show called Kato-chan Ken-chan Gokingen TV, aka Fun TV with Kato and Ken, which actually ended up being the inspiration for America's Funniest Home Videos. The game featured the hosts Kato and Ken recreating the detective segments from the show with its perverted humor mixed in, and then all rolled up into a platformer. JJ and Jeff being a censored version of that game, because South Park hadn't been invented yet, made things even weirder because now the characters were doing things like using a spray can as an attack instead of farting, and then having the character that was pooping in the background before now wearing a bear mask, because that's somehow better. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are now confused because I've somehow managed to talk about video game characters pooping in what's supposed to be a review about a Pac-Man game. Well, hi, my name is Dave and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where, maybe that is inappropriate, but you have to admit Pac-Man does eat an awful lot of pellets. Don't they have to go somewhere? Anyway, I'm about to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis, either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Full disclosure, I did not plan that previous joke, it just kind of came out. Anyway, believe it or not, there's a reason why I started out this review talking about JJ and Jeff. Through the first almost 300 episodes of Zilog and Moto, I've reviewed a lot of different types of games. But so far, I hadn't reviewed a game that I thought could hold a candle to JJ and Jeff's weirdness. Sure, there's been stuff like Basketball Nightmare, a sports game where you play against monsters, or The Adventures of Willie Beamish, an adventure game that increasingly feels like a fever dream the further you get into it. And of course there's both Toe Jam and Earl titles that are nothing if not wholly original releases. But I just hadn't played a game that really had that same feeling of WTF that JJ and Jeff had until this week. And to put the weirdness over the top, the game is based around possibly the most familiar and seemingly innocuous video game character that we have in Pac-Man. Everyone's played Pac-Man. You're a round, yellow guy that runs around a maze and eats pellets while trying to avoid ghosts. And yes, that does sound a little weird when I say it out loud like that, but people have been playing Pac-Man for so long, it's totally normal. So how could Namco make a sequel to Pac-Man and have it be weird? It's one of the most traditional arcade games that we have. Well, they did, and we'll get into just how weird it is in a minute, but first, a look at the completely boring in comparison package. And here's my copy of Pac-Man 2: The New Adventures. One thing that you'll notice immediately about this copy is that it's in a cardboard box, which isn't too unusual for Genesis releases, but in this case, the cardboard box actually signifies that this is a re-release version of this game. The original release of Pac-Man 2 was in a standard clamshell, but this is one of a series of games re-released by Ballistic, aka Accolade, as you can see by the sticker on the back. Due to this being the cardboard box version, it's not only more fragile, so it's taken a bit of damage and wear, but it also comes with the cheaper Xeroxed manual that they used on those later releases. However, the fun doesn't stop there. Apparently, the clamshell version also came in two variations, with one of the versions being a special edition cover that had a lenticular insert with an animated Pac-Man that emphasized the fact that they were presenting the game as an interactive cartoon. So if you're browsing eBay and you see a copy that looks a little odd at first glance, that's why. Regardless of whether you're picking up the clamshell or cardboard box version, Pac-Man 2 is relatively inexpensive, and it currently goes for around $15 depending on condition, so with it being that cheap, I'll definitely be trying to replace this copy with that lenticular clamshell version instead. With all these different versions of the game out there, you'd think that there was probably an international release or two to compare it with, but no, Pac-Man 2 for the Genesis is exclusively a North American release, and I mean really exclusively, as there's not even a Brazilian version out there, not at least a legal one anyway. I'm not exactly sure why that is, due to the Super Nintendo version appearing in all three main regions, but perhaps Namco thought that in late 1994, the Mega Drive market just wasn't strong enough to support the release. Due to that, this is the only cover art for the game, and actually, I don't hate it. It's got Pac-Man freaking out while using a hang glider as one of the ghosts mocks him from the trees, and it's definitely eye-catching and representative of the actual gameplay. Other than the note about the game being an interactive cartoon down at the bottom, the only other thing that really stands out is the red VRC rating down at the bottom. I'm not exactly sure what's going on there with it being in red. I don't think I've seen that on any other release, and honestly, it's kind of bizarre that both the original and re-release versions have VRC ratings at all, since the VRC stopped being a thing a few months before the game was released due to having been replaced by the ESRB. Flipping over the back, and the layout is pretty basic, with some screenshots over to the right that don't really do the game justice, as it's kind of hard to see what's going on in them. I did find it funny that for the last screenshot it states, "Play the original Pac-Man and a mystery Pac game in their entirety." And it's really not a mystery, it's just Pac Jr., but I guess points for them trying to drum up interest. More notable than that, though, is this section here, where apparently Namco tried to trademark CGI as standing for Character Guidance Interface. Because, I mean, that's what we all think of when we think of CGI in 2025, right? Inside the box is the cartridge and photocopied manual that I referred to earlier, and here's another reason to replace this copy, as the staples have managed to get pretty gnarly over the years. For the most part, though, the manual does a decent job of explaining the game, but there is one fairly ugly issue in that it mixes up the functions of the A and B buttons. And you'd think that with this being the re-release version, that they would have fixed that with this version of the manual, but no, it's still messed up. Good job, Accolade. Okay, that's the package. Let's get to the review and look at the game that I spent way more time playing this week than I had originally planned. Previously on the channel, I've reviewed Pac-Man adjacent title Pac-Mania for both the Master System and the Genesis. If you aren't familiar with Pac-Mania and you haven't seen those reviews, well, shame on you, but Pac-Mania, like say Miss Pac-Man before it, is probably what most people would consider a traditional sequel to Pac-Man. Pac-Mania takes the previously very two-dimensional Pac-Man and recreates the game in 3D, while also adding the ability of Pac-Man to jump, to coincide with its newfound 3D-ness. But even with taking Pac-Man, flipping it on its side, and spinning it slightly, it's still for all intents and purposes Pac-Man. You're still controlling Pac-Man as you navigate a maze while collecting pellets, with the goal of collecting all the pellets while avoiding ghosts to make it to the next level, where you do the same thing all over again. Again, it's a more traditional sequel, where the developers took an existing game and just tweaked and updated it slightly so that it would appeal to fans of the original game and maybe attract new ones. With this week's game being named Pac-Man 2: The New Adventures, you would think that it would follow a similar format, of the game being just a slightly updated, reworked version of the original. I mean, it's called Pac-Man 2 for Pete's sake. Pac-Mania didn't even have a number in the title, and it was still a traditional sequel. But no, other than the inclusion of some of the original Pac-related arcade games as mini-games here, the only similarity that Pac-Man 2 has with the original Pac-Man is that they both feature the same main character, the same enemies in the ghosts Pinky, Blinky, Inky, and Clyde, and there is the use of power pellets to help out Pac-Man. But other than that, this is indeed a new adventure. As far as sequels go, Pac-Man 2 is actually more of a sequel to Pac-Land, the arcade side-scrolling platformer that was Namco's first attempt to try to go in a different direction with the Pac-Man series. But even that's not really accurate, at least in the traditional sense. While it could be argued that both Pac-Land and Pac-Man 2 carry some inspiration from the Hanna-Barbera Pac-Man cartoon from the early 80s, and Pac-Man 2 does have some side-scrolling sections, that's where the comparisons between the two games end. Instead, Pac-Man 2 is truly like no other game I've ever played. If I had to give it a genre, I think I'd go with an amalgam of point-and-click adventure and action. And if that sounds weird, like say putting fried cheesecake bites on a hamburger, it is. But believe it or not, it kind of works, just like that hamburger. And no, I did not come up with that myself, it's a real burger that's being served at the Hard Rock Cafe at the moment. Like a traditional point-and-click adventure game, you're controlling Pac-Man as he walks from location to location, with each area having different things to click on, for Pac-Man to interact with. Except, you're not really clicking on things, you're using a slingshot to shoot regular Pac-Man pellets at the screen, which you're targeting with a crosshair. But when you shoot at the things on the screen, which includes Pac-Man by the way, it's not that you're just clicking on them with a slingshot, you really are shooting them, which has the items react like they've been shot. This is part of where the action comes in because it's almost like you're playing the game as if it's a rail shooter, not unlike Dynamite Duke, which we covered last week. I feel like I'm explaining this somewhat clumsily, so hopefully seeing the game footage on screen will help everything make sense. But the game being this difficult to explain speaks to just how unusual it is. Along with being able to shoot smaller items on the screen that potentially will fall to the ground for Pac-Man to eventually pick up, you can also shoot at larger items in the background, like say a door or a sign. If you do that, Pac-Man will see you shooting at it and choose to go towards it, and either interact with the item or go to the next area. This can be useful for navigation at times, but it's actually not the primary way that you move Pac-Man around. Truth be told, you aren't actually in control of Pac-Man at all. I guess he got tired of being run around mazes and into ghosts. So now he has a mind of his own, and you're just along for the ride. At best, you can direct Pac-Man into looking left, right, up, or down, which will cause Pac-Man to either look in the direction that you're indicating, or walk to that part of the screen. Between the slingshot and giving Pac-Man stage directions, which I guess ties into the interactive cartoon concept, you'll eventually get used to moving Pac-Man around and exploring the different areas of the game. But it definitely takes some practice, especially if you're expecting a straight point-and-click adventure, and even then, sometimes things can get a bit frustrating. Of course, it wouldn't be a Pac-Man game if there weren't power pellets, and those are in the game as well, but honestly, they're more of a nuisance than anything else. The only thing the power pellets are good for is turning Pac-Man into Super Pac-Man, which is good for when you have the occasional fight against the ghosts, or the final boss, but other than that, they serve little to no purpose. You can only hold 3 power pellets at a time, so if you ever run out, which will happen, due to Pac-Man being a total baby if you don't shoot a power pellet directly into his mouth when he's in trouble, have fun backtracking all the way to either Pac-Man's house or to the arcade to get some more before retrying whatever you're attempting to do, by the way. This actually becomes a bit of an issue when you're attempting to learn how to fight the final boss. Just be warned. However, there is a trick to that, which allows you to avoid all that backtracking, and that involves the use of the game's password system. With Pac-Man 2 being an adventure game, at least in a very loose sense, it makes sense that it would have some sort of save game system. Unfortunately, for one very specific reason, the game doesn't use battery backup for save games, but it does at least have a password system that works very well with keeping up with which items you've collected and which level you're in, and most importantly, where you are on the map. So, for instance, in the case of that final boss showdown, you could theoretically just get the password before going into that area, and use the password if you die on the gum monster. Gum monster. The text is a little hard to read. Just a quick sidebar, the plot of the game is just as bananas as everything else that goes on. Apparently the ghosts now have a boss, in the form of the Ghost Witch. The Ghost Witch is attempting to get the ghost to stop Pac-Man from interfering in her plans, which of course goes about as well as you would expect, but you might want to stop and think about what kind of plans a Ghost Witch would have. Well, in the minds of the designers at Namco, the Ghost Witch is attempting to take over Pac City by stealing all of the bubble gum from kids to create a gum monster. Except the kids really shouldn't care that much because apparently the gum that the Ghost Witch is stealing to create the gum monster is what's called ABC gum. Is that some kind of nice brand of gum in Pac City, maybe that's really sticky? No. You see, in this case, ABC gum stands for Already Been Chewed Gum, which the ghosts have been collecting from the bottoms of tables and desks and such. So Pac-Man's ultimate goal is to defeat the Ghost Witch by defeating her gum monster, which is made of discarded chewing gum. Now do you understand why I led the review with discussing how bizarre JJ and Jeff is? Anyway, back to the save game system. As well as it works for practical gameplay purposes, there's one area in which it's not very helpful, and that's if you're trying to 100% the game. That's right, Pac-Man 2 is one of the earliest games that I can recall that actually has a running percentage counter, although it's hidden by default. You have to hold the A and C buttons when in the pause menu to see what percentage you're at. The reason why the password system doesn't work well for that is while it keeps up with the items that you have and where you are, it doesn't track every little thing that you do as Pac-Man, and all of those little things are what contribute to your percentage going up. Actually, due to all of those, sometimes seemingly insignificant things that you do contributing to your score, no one had ever managed to actually 100% the game in the first 30 years or so of its existence, until about a year or so ago when some hardcore Pac-Man fans were finally able to manage it, and thankfully that's now been documented via a video on Solomon's Still the Best channel, which I'll link in the description if you're curious. This is all a very long way of saying that while I like the fact that Namco had the forethought to include a percentage in the game to give players something to keep striving for once they figure out how to beat it, unfortunately the password save system makes trying to achieve a high percentage a bit unwieldy. One last thing about the gameplay in Pac-Man 2, it's not all shooting at random objects on the screen and trying to keep Pac-Man from tripping over rocks. There are 2 dedicated action sequences. Well, I mean technically 4, as 2 are hidden and related to that mythical 100% counter. With one sequence involving Pac-Man using a hang glider, as shown on the cover of the game, and of course, a minecart section. I like the fact that these sequences were added to the game as they serve as mini-games to break up the adventure aspect, but unfortunately, they're both still centered around the slingshot mechanics of having to shoot Pac-Man to get him to do something, and they both could have been so much better had they been given an alternate control scheme. It's a real missed opportunity. I mean, I get what they were going for, but it ends up feeling like the old NES light gun game Gumshoe, where you're shooting at the screen to get the character to jump, and it just never feels right. From a graphical perspective, Pac-Man 2 refers to itself as an interactive cartoon, and I think that's actually a somewhat accurate statement, and not just marketing mumbo-jumbo. All of the areas in Pac-Man 2 are well drawn and clearly had some thought put into not just the backgrounds, but also the various side characters. While most of the animation is centered around Pac-Man and not just his movements, but also his emotions, there's also nice little touches with the NPCs, like say for instance, when Pac-Man annoys the hot dog vendor by having the audacity to ask for a second hot dog after the first one is stolen by a cat. Or the balloon vendor who in a fit of rage does his best Dig Dug impression and inflates Pac-Man like a balloon. By late 1994, there were definitely better looking 16-bit games on the market, including the version of Pac-Man 2 on the Super Nintendo, which has an additional layer of parallax scrolling and some more advanced transparencies, but based on how the rest of the game is constructed, I think the graphics are totally appropriate here. The sound, on the other hand, well, let me be fair. The game's background music isn't terrible. It has some decent instrumentation, and there's a good amount of it, so unless you happen to be playing the same minecart sequence over and over and over again, the music isn't really going to be a problem. I wouldn't say the music is good, but it's at least decent and doesn't distract from the on-screen action, something that I can't say about the very synth-heavy Super Nintendo soundtrack. But while the background music is perfectly cromulent,
The sound effects are very rough and not mixed well at all, being much quieter than the music. Ironically, the opposite problem of what we saw last week with Dynamite Duke. This isn't usually a problem I run into, so it's a little weird to hear it 2 weeks in a row. Regardless of the volume and the effects, they just aren't very good. Pac-Man in particular doesn't appear to speak English, so when he responds to your prompts, you just get odd-sounding gibberish as an acknowledgement. But even when a more traditional effect plays, it'll either be underwhelming or confusing. One of the effects you'll hear more frequently is supposed to be look look for when you're doing your Navi impression and trying to tell Pac-Man where to look on the screen, but it sounds like woof woof instead. So I guess replace Navi with Lassie? And I can't believe I just went from a 30-year-old reference to a 70-year-old reference. Really keeping up with the times there, that Zilog and Moto. Anyway, after playing Pac-Man 2 this week, I can safely say it was not what I was expecting, at all. And the subtitle of The New Adventures might be one of the most appropriate subtitles I've ever seen. This is not a game that anyone could have expected, and it certainly is a new adventure for both Pac-Man fans and new players alike. Pac-Man anything in the mid-90s was going to be a hard sell, as gaming had long since passed by most of the games that Pac-Man was known for at that point. So I've got to hand it to Namco. They really tried to do something different here with Pac-Man 2, and I honestly think they succeeded in making something fun and interesting. Is it a very strange game? Yes, absolutely. But there's been plenty of odd games out there that have done well, and honestly, I really like the fact that they try to do something different. You know, there's so many times on this channel where it's just like, oh, I'm playing that type of game again. And you can't say that about Pac-Man 2. As a result, I'm going to go a bit outside the box myself and give Pac-Man 2 The New Adventures 3 stars. The game is certainly not perfect, and if you know what to do, you can beat it relatively quickly, but I think it still deserves a lot of credit for daring to do something new and different, especially with an established character.
And that's it for Pac-Man 2 The New Adventures. I'm sure a lot of people are going to see this review and not agree with it at all, or think that I'm out of my mind for rating it as high as I did, as, you know, it's not exactly an in-demand title on the resale market. But I've got to be honest, I think a lot of people are probably missing out by sleeping on this game, and if you've never played it, I definitely recommend grabbing a copy and giving it a chance. You know, I don't think that I would give it, diamond in the rough status necessarily, but there's at least some semi-precious metals going on here. This was the type of game that I was hoping to come across last week with Dynamite Duke, so I'm glad that I finally stumbled upon it this week instead. Next time on the channel, I hadn't done any racing in a bit, and I haven't played a racing game on the Genesis at all this year, so I think it's time to get into some 16-bit speed. I've picked out a game that I've played a few times in the arcades, but I've never gotten the chance to mess with its home ports on either the Genesis or the Master System. I'll be honest, I don't think I ever did that well with playing it in the arcades, but I also don't feel like I probably tried it enough times either. So I'm looking forward to, being able to give it some more time this week without the need for a roll of quarters. I don't think that I've got any puns as far as the name goes. I mean, I tossed around something with James Bond, but, it just wasn't working. So here's your clue. Figure it out. Anyway, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 296. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.